Welcome, friends and listeners, to today's podcast. And we have a big event coming up. I think all of us know it is on the Sunday this week. That is Jan 26th. Yes, is the release of our beloved maestro Ilayaraja's Symphony. Today we are going to talk about it, the significance of the release, the pre-release expectations, and also go a bit more into what's a symphony, how is it going to sound, and all that. So this is going to be a very, very special episode. And I'm really honored to be the host for today. So please fasten your seatbelts and stay tuned till the end. This is one episode you don't want to miss. Okay? Okay, now let's welcome our expert. Hello, hi Dachu. Hope you're doing good. So there is a symphony release coming up, right? We're all excited, right? Can you share your thoughts?
See, as an Ilayaraja fan, I know that I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of people like us who have listened to Ilayaraja's music for years and decades, actually. I think as an Ilayaraja fan, we slowly, song by song, movie by movie, year by year, decade by decade, we have slowly gotten a dose of Western classical music through his cinema compositions. And not just the cinema compositions, it's also the other albums that he has composed, right? So things like How to Name It, Composer's Breath, and Tiruvasagam, etc. Even these pieces, these have been the means through which we, as an audience, have been sensitized and cultivated to listen to the sounds of Western classical music, right? So for me, this symphony is a phenomenal opportunity where I think that slow education, if you treat it that way, is going to culminate in something really dramatic, right? It almost feels like Ilayaraja has almost planned it this way, that the audience must be taught, cultivated over a long period of time. Of course, he intended to release the symphony some decades ago, but better late than never. At least now we get to hear it. So that's really the most important thing that I'm looking forward to.
Great. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. I totally agree on that. See, actually, you mentioned the non-music albums, right? Like Tiruvasagam Symphony, How to Name It. So, I mean, they many people actually call it even it's called Tiruvasagam Symphony, right? So, can we bracket these albums, right, and a symphony?
No, a symphony has a specific format to it, and that's one of the things we'll cover today. Tiruvasagam fits the requirements or the template of what is called an oratorio in Western classical music. A symphony is going to be a little bit different. We'll explore that today.
Right. Okay. So, when you say symphony, how is it going to sound like? I mean, we have listened to Tiruvasagam Symphony, Have to Name It, and all that. Can you describe how would this music sound like?
It's going to be very authentically Western classical. And when I say very authentically Western classical, let me again say that whatever we've heard so far from Ilayaraja through his albums and through his cinema music is more of a hybrid between folk, Indian classical music, mostly Carnatic, right. And some Western sounds and instruments and orchestrations, right? It's been a blend of everything. Right. But think about music where these other elements are not going to be present. It's going to be completely Western classical. I mean, that's what the symphony is going to sound like to me.
Right. Oh, great. Yeah, so great. Nice. Hello, listeners, Raja fans, everybody. So I think we are going to delve more into what's a symphony and all that in the next part of the section. So let me start by asking, so now what is a symphony? Let's try to understand. Can you share a bit more about what exactly is a symphony?
Symphony is one form of a Western classical composition. There are many types of compositions in Western classical music. Things like a concerto or an oratorio, like I mentioned a little while ago, a fugue, a choral symphony, a sonata. These are all different kinds of compositions. Just like in Indian classical music, you can see a varnam, a kriti, a javali, a tilana, etc. Right? And specifically, a symphony is one of the most complex forms of composition that you can see. It's a very mature composition. It's a very large-scale composition. It has multiple movements in it. And one of the most important things to remember about a symphony is that it needs to incorporate the sonata form in the first movement. That's probably one of the most defining characteristics of the symphony.
So when you say sonata form, it's different from the sonata. I mean, the sonata is another type of composition, right? It's different.
Correct. Right. A sonata is a type of composition. Okay. A sonata form is like a template. It's a model that composers use to arrange the different sections of music.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, you mentioned different types of composition, and this symphony is probably the magnum opus or something, right, of Western classical music. Like, so, is there a historical context to this? Like, I mean, who creates this symphony? Who kind of come with this, this greatest composition or something?
Right. See, the idea of a symphony goes back to the Baroque period. At that time, it was not called a symphony. It used to be called a sinfonia. That's an Italian term. Mostly instrumental music really became a thing, a standalone thing during the Baroque era. And slowly it evolved. Multiple formats of all instrumental music, evolved one by one. And a symphony is the final outcome of that. You rightly pointed it out as a magnum opus, right? I mean, it's a kind of music where the entire orchestra is presented, right? Not one instrument at a time, but the entire orchestra is playing all the time. That's what a symphony is. And historically, if you see, symphony reached its high point of maturity, if you will, and shape and form through three main composers. One of them being Haydn, the other being Beethoven and Mozart. These three classical era composers were the ones who really defined what a symphony should look like, what it should sound like.
Right. Nice. I think we all know the composers. I think nice to hear the names. Okay, so can we delve a bit more deeper into the symphony? Like, for example, are there some properties a symphony should have and not?
Yeah, I mean, the one of the most important things that a symphony should do is it should be set up in multiple movements. So, I mean, naturally, people would be wondering what a movement is, right? A movement is a section of music that is continuous. Inside it, there are no gaps. But between subsequent movements, there is a gap. So the music is arranged in such a way that there are multiple movements. These movements have some sort of a contrasting nature. So the first movement will be fast. The second movement will be slow. The third movement will be kind of like a dance-like movement, trimeter, waltz, kind of thing. And then the last movement will again be a little bit faster. So that's one thing. Typical symphonies in the post-classical era have four movements, but there are symphonies with three movements as well. That's one thing. The second thing is it's orchestral. The entire symphony orchestra the music is written for all the sections of the orchestra. And the symphony orchestra will have multiple sections. It'll have a string section, it'll have a percussion section, a brass section, a woodwind section. All of these sections have parts that are written by the composer.
Okay.
So that's the other thing that we should remember. And of course, the sonata form. The first movement of the symphony is usually in the sonata form.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, that reminds me the Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. When you said movements, you can see a lot of contrast. It starts like with a bang or something, and then ta-ta-ta-ta like that. And then later it goes on. Yeah, I think that's a nice way to understand it. I mean, when you say sounds, right? Are there some instruments or sounds that must be there? Or at least advised to be there and advised not to be there. Can we come with are there some instruments, sounds like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the most important sounds you'll always hear in a symphony is the string section. Usually the string section carries the weight of all the entire orchestration, right? And then the brass section, the woodwind section, and the percussion section will make up some instruments that you generally not hear in a symphony orchestra. One example would be a guitar. Back in the day, when Western classical instrumental music was evolving, the instruments needed to be loud. So an instrument like the guitar is very soft. It doesn't belong in a symphonic setting.
I see.
And also in a symphony orchestra, they do not really amplify the sound in any artificial manner. It's usually just a microphone, just like a vocalist microphone. That's all you'll see for certain instruments, right?
Okay.
So that's why you will not find an instrument like the guitar. The other instrument you won't find is the piano. Generally, you'll not find a piano there because its sound doesn't gel with the other traditional sounds
I see.
of a symphony
Okay.
orchestra. However, it doesn't mean that the kind of music that you hear through a guitar is not possible in a symphony. You can. You have an instrument called the harp. You can have, very often, many symphony orchestras do have harp players in them, and the harp can take on some of the same kind of music that is written for a guitar.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, you just go back, right? You mentioned sonata form, right, which is like the crux of the whole thing, or the key of the thing. Can you tell us more about it so that people can understand it better?
Right. So the sonata form, you have to imagine as one continuous section of music. It can be as short as 3 minutes, or it can be as long as 20 minutes or even 30 minutes. It doesn't matter. But generally, it will be one continuous section of music, which can be viewed as consisting of 3 different parts. One is an introductory part. Technically, it's called the exposition. And then the second part is called the development section, where the music is expanded. And the third part is called the recapitulation section. So what the composer tries to do in this sonata form is they will introduce a theme in the very first section, the exposition section. Let's say that the theme is in the key of C, okay? Then the objective will be in the exposition section itself to do a key modulation to the key of G. Why G? Simply because there is a 1 to 5 relationship. That's all. It's called the dominant.
Okay.
You go from C to G, it's 1 to 5. So there will always be a key modulation to the 5th, right? In the sonata form. After reaching that G, they will introduce a second theme, which will usually be a little contrasting to the first theme. Let's say the first theme is very peppy, very fast moving, or very energetic or happy. The second movement may be a little bit more mellow, right? It may not have that many jumpy notes, etc. So they'll try to contrast already. Once that exposition section is done, in the development section, what the composer will try to do is they'll take bits and pieces, fragments, they're called fragments, of the 2 themes in the exposition, and they will try to transform and attach and detach and expand and contract all of these fragments through various musical devices, some devices are called sequences and so on. And they will simply do a lot of key modulation. The music will go from one key to another key to another key. It will seem like a never-ending process of key modulations. And then finally, in the recapitulation section, you will come back to both the original theme and the contrasting theme, both of which were introduced in the exposition. Both of those will now come back to the original starting key, the key of C, in the example that I just gave. That, in essence, is a sonata form. And this sonata form, if people understand how to make sense of the sonata form, it is very easy, and it's like opening a treasure trove of education and lesson classical music, because you can listen to string quartets, you can listen to concertos, and you can listen to a whole lot of other composition types just by knowing that this is what the composer intends to do.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. So now, actually, when you said this 4 movements and contrast, right? I mean, to me, it sounds like, this is a story or something, could be conveyed, right, through this symphony, contrasting emotions and all that. I mean, can we say that, the symphony generally conveys a story or maybe some set of emotions?
Absolutely. It has the potential to do so. Some composers adopt a completely free-flowing composition model where they're not really trying to tell you any story. But some composers have done it. For example, if you take Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6, which is also called the Pathetique Symphony, it is often said that he composed it specifically to communicate the fact that he was going to die. He pretty much died about 6 days after the premiere of that symphony. The
Really?
other composer,
Oh,
yeah. This was back, I think it was about 9 days or something after the premiere of the symphony was conducted. And another composer who's done a lot of this is Dmitri Shostakovich. He's done more than one symphony. Symphony number 10 is one, symphony number 7, symphony number 11. In all of these, he's had movements in a symphony which depicted historical events, which he was very upset about. He's depicted Stalin in one particular movement. He didn't get along with Stalin, right? And then he's depicted 19 in the early Russian, early 20th century in Russia, when the Tsar was still around before the First World War. There was an event where a lot of the peasants had gathered to protest in the cold. They waited for the Tsar, but the Tsar never showed up. The army came in and massacred a whole lot of them. So there's actually a movement where Shostakovich has depicted this scene.
Really?
Right.
So actually,
we'll
that kind of
go on. Yeah, we can include that.
That actually reminded me another episode. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I read a story that that was composed around the time he was losing his hearing ability.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
So that's why it's called fate knocking on the door or something. Maybe it is concocted by the author of the book, who wrote the book on Beethoven. But this kind of it sounded interesting. Anyway, so now I want to come back to our main subject, which is Ilayaraja's symphony, right? So now that the Ilayaraja symphony is going to come out and we're all excited and all that, can I ask you, what are your expectations about the symphony?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, look, this is Ilayaraja's first symphony. So in some senses, he could compose it as a traditional symphony. He could stick with, the sonata form. He could not introduce much vocal writing into it. As you know, Ilayaraja is very fond of writing choral parts for voices. Typically in a symphony, you don't expect to hear vocal writing. There are some exceptions, but typically not. So if he decides to go traditional, I would not expect any choral singing. And I would probably expect to hear a lot of the brass section, because just going by the title of the symphony, I believe it's called Valiant, and because of the fact that it is being released on Republic Day, I suspect that it has something to do with India, or there is some sort of a theme there. So that's just my expectation, right? I mean, I could be completely wrong, but that's where I'm thinking. But if he decides to depart from tradition, right, which a lot of composers have done it after the Romantic period. A lot of composers now don't necessarily follow strictly the original way in which the symphonies were written. So he could bring in some of his trademark innovations. We heard a lot in his bass writing in the cinema songs. He could bring in something like that. There could be some counterpoint that he's writing, which maybe because of all the songs that we've listened to, our minds might go back and say, yeah, that sounds familiar, right? Who knows? That could be something that will show up at some point. So I have a feeling that he's done so much of music writing for movies. It would not surprise me at all if there were echoes of something that we've heard before.
I kind of agree. I think you raised all our expectations a lot, and I don't think I can't wait. I can't wait to get my hands on the album and listen to it. Anyway, I guess it's time to wrap up. Thanks a lot, Dachu. I think it was very insightful and all that. Great, man. Okay. Thank you to all our listeners. Please, I hope you also had a nice time with this podcast. Please leave a review if you like it, and feel free to share this episode with all the fellow music lovers. I think this is a great event, and all the music pieces that we covered, we'll try to put a link to them in the description. And okay, anyway, thanks Dachu, thanks everyone. Bye-bye, take care.